Welcome to the World of Eora, a news and lore podcast about the Pillars of Eternity games, as well as Obsidian Entertainment's upcoming release, Avowed. Hello everybody and welcome to another episode of the World of Eora. I'm your host Eric, aka Gingerino. Thanks everyone for joining me today as we dive into the history, lore, and game mechanics of Pillars of Eternity 1 and 2 as we gear up for the release of Avowed. The reason all those games are featured together is because they share the same fantasy setting known as Eora. So as the theory goes, as we dive into the Pillars of Eternity series, we can glean insights into the development of Avowed, the stories that are going to be there, have a nuanced understanding of the world, and therefore have a better appreciation for the game when it releases, and just enjoy it more. Today's episode is going to be a weird one, and I'm not sure how people are going to receive it. We're going to find out. Today we're talking about Dungeons and Dragons in the setting of Eora. So if you ever thought to yourself, man, I'd sure love to play Dungeons and Dragons in the world of Eora, well, we're going to be talking about doing that today. Now, before I begin, I will let you know that there are already a lot of resources out there, a lot of homebrews done by talented people that know what they're doing in this regard and have created a lot of stuff for people to use. I talk about it a little bit more in today's episode. I'm recording this introduction separately, so I'll talk about it a little bit more once the lore part of the show kicks in. But you can find my Reddit post on the Project Eternity Reddit community under the name D&D in Eora, current resources list, and in that I have a number of links that lead to homebrew websites or homebrew articles for certain things, such as the unique races in the world of Eora, a player's guide to the setting, as well as some classes and subclasses that exist within the world. It's not a comprehensive list, not every single thing is homebrewed for this world, but there's a lot in there for you to check out. I will say I do not know whether these homebrews are balanced well. I've never play tested them, but just by perusing some of them, a lot of them look good. There are a few that look way too overpowered, but I'll leave it up to you and your players to figure that out. Speaking of you and your players, I am presuming today's episode that those of you listening have at least a passing familiarity with Dungeons and Dragons, as well as a lot of the lore that I've talked about from Pillars of Eternity. I'm not expecting you to be a huge lore nerd, like you know everything in Pillars of Eternity, but that you've at least played the first game, and you have a basic understanding of what the world is like, and kind of the stories that happen within it. And as for Dungeons & Dragons, I'm mostly just expecting that you've either played it once or twice, or that you are at least familiar with character creation and kind of how the setup works. Again, you don't have to be a thoroughgoing expert, but it's just that you're familiar enough to understand the terms that I'm going to be discussing today. I do also kind of address this episode as if you are someone who is interested in being a dungeon master for the game, which is that you are interested in running a Dungeons & Dragons game in the world of Eora. Now, the last disclaimer I need to give, and this is just to kind of set expectations properly and also not get too much hate email, is that in today's episode, I'm going to be discussing what I call a minimalist and brute force conversion of the Dungeons & Dragons rule set into the setting of Eora. Now, conversion might not be the right word. I think transposition would be a better word, but whatever. I've already used it, so who cares? Just so that you understand what that means and doesn't mean. What it does not mean is that I go through each race, I go through each class, I go through each spell and monster, and tell you everything that you need to change, including the name and the flavors and the lore and all that kind of stuff. There are some pieces of this episode where I am presuming that you have familiarity enough with Dungeons & Dragons and Pillars of Eternity to see where some changes need to be made. For example, when you want to use Pale Elves from Pillars of Eternity lore, that when you sub in elves from the Dungeons & Dragons rule set, you know to add something like cold resistance, because that makes sense, right? That's just something I'm expecting that you guys will know how to do, or that you will do things like that. So I don't point out every tiny idiosyncrasy, partly because there's not enough time in one episode to do that, but also partly because I don't want to pigeonhole you guys into one or two things. I want you guys to be creative in how you approach this. But again, this is a minimalist and brute force transposition, as I'm calling it. And what that basically means is that I want to keep it very simple and accessible. I have this in mind that maybe you have new players in your game and they might be overwhelmed by a bunch of homebrew stuff, or coming up with a whole extra set of handouts on top of a core rulebook might be a little too much for them. Or just the fact that you as a DM might not want to keep track of a bunch of different things. So I'm making it minimalist so that it is simple and accessible. It's just very easy to transpose current D&D rules and content into the Eora setting, rather than having to homebrew everything from scratch. And when I say brute force, what I mean by that is that I am not going to fiddle around with the settings too much of monsters or classes or races. Like, I want to keep things as close to the original as they are in Dungeons and Dragons rules and mechanics, and just play that game in the world of Eora. So it's not a conversion, because like I am not converting races. I'm not doing a lot of homebrews. I am only taking already existing content from Dungeons and Dragons, and I am shoehorning it into the Pillars of Eternity universe that is Eora. And there's going to be some times where the shoehorning doesn't fit very well, but we will make it fit. There might be certain times where you have to suspend your disbelief, or you might have a little bit of dissonance, things like that. One thing to keep in mind going forward is that feel free to rewrite the lore of any of these things as we go. Obviously, for example, if you're taking dwarves from Dungeons and Dragons and you're playing those dwarves from that game in the setting of Eora, you're going to want to change the lore, right? So make sure your players are aware of the lore difference. And I do talk about the important lore differences right away in this episode. So I think those are all the disclaimers. Again, if anyone here is expecting a thoroughgoing homebrew or a really comprehensive set of changes that you need to make, that's not what this episode is for. I just want to get you guys playing this game at your table as fast as possible with as little, I would say, headache and obstacles that are getting in your way. It's meant to be simple, accessible, and just transposing the rules that already exist into the setting. Okay, I think I've belabored this enough. Thanks for listening on that. Let's dive into today's content.
I'm curious. What exactly did you find there?
So in order to be able to play Pillars of Eternity at your table for a tabletop role-playing game, then you're going to need to have a pitch ready for the rest of the crew. Now, I'm assuming for most of this that the Dungeon Master or the Game Master is going to be pitching this. So if I ever refer to the person listening to this as the Dungeon Master, I'm just kind of defaulting to that. But there's no reason that the player couldn't be the person bringing all this to the table. Now, before I move forward, I want to give you guys a resource online for all of this stuff. So we're trying to play Dungeons and Dragons in the setting of Pillars of Eternity, which is the World of Eora, and there is a lot of homebrewed content out there. To make it easy for everyone, I have put it all into a comprehensive list, and I've put a post on Reddit. If you go onto Reddit and you go onto Project Eternity, so the Reddit community of Project Eternity, which is the Pillars of Eternity subreddit, I posted one on the 12th of September. It's under my name, Gingerino, and it's titled D&D in Eora, Current Resources List. So if you wanted to look for that, you can find it there, and hopefully I'll just put it in the description notes of this episode. And in this post, I have well over a dozen, might even be 24 links to different homebrewed content. We have things like races such as the Godlike, Amauans, Orlans, and even a comprehensive page which includes stuff for like elves and pale elves and things like that. We have classes like Chanter, Cypher, the subclass of Bleakwalker from Paladin. There's a whole bunch of stuff on here. The things that I am going to recommend that I'm going to be utilizing a lot today is a resource that is developed by user Jacenat, Jacenat, who uses someone else's work, user Erixperience, Erixperience. Both of these people on Reddit. Erixperience originally created this document, and Jacenat, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, has added to it and updated it and put some other things in there. So that is what I recommend you guys look at. It's called the World of Eora setting and the World of Eora player's guide. In the World of Eora setting, it is broken down really well for your people at the table. And so I'm just going to recommend that you look at that, and that way you can think how to formulate best to pitch everything to the players at your table. We have things like the power of souls being important, the geography of the world, like what are the major factions and nations that you're going to be dealing with, the cultures from each of those nations, so that when you build your characters, you understand that kind of things. There's a lot of lore in here about the Deerwood, which is the area for the first Pillars of Eternity game, because the creator of this document, Jacenat, he's kind of wanting to move towards you playing the story of the Pillars of Eternity game at the table. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. Like if you want to play your own game just in Eora in general, you can still use all this lore to help you out. The calendar for this fantasy world is broken down, the name of the moons. There's a short description of each one of the gods so that it doesn't go too far in depth that it's overwhelming, but it's just like a paragraph and then some holy symbols and domains so that it can help you and the players just kind of move forward. There is the known history of Eora section, which just talks about the ancient Engwith history as well. It talks about some of the recent wars in the Deerwood just prior to the Pillars of Eternity, the first Pillars of Eternity game, as well as Widewind's legacy in the Saints War, which is important. If you've played the Pillars of Eternity game, you'll know the history there. So a lot of this, again, is geared towards the lore for the Pillars of Eternity setting. If that doesn't interest you, though, there's so much in here that is good for just the setting in general. Now, as for the pitch for you and your players for how can you sell the idea that, okay, I want to play Dungeons & Dragons in Eora, I'm not going to stay too long on this because I think that if you're listening to this, you're already convinced and you feel like you could probably convince your table. But I will say that if you do want to make sure that everyone is on the same page and understand what it is that they're getting into, then you should have a proper pitch ready. You should have them to understand. And I think the easiest focal point to do that from is by looking at essence, which is the stuff that souls are made of in this world. So in the world of Eora, everybody has a soul. You have a soul, I have a soul, rocks have souls, animals have souls, and souls are made up of stuff, if you will, called essence. So it's capital E, essence. And that's kind of the focal point for a lot of this world. The gods of the world, which are not some weird high-minded idea in the minds of some people, they are actual real things, and they're very factual entities in this world, and they have an impact on the world. So the things that you're going to want to let your players know is that this takes place, if they're Earth history buffs, this takes place roughly around Age of Enlightenment / Renaissance era of our own human history in terms of technology. I would consider this to be low fantasy as a fantasy setting, so magic isn't high-minded and crazy. There aren't floating ships left, right, and center. Not everyone's throwing magic in a flashy way left, right, and center. So I would consider it low fantasy. The world is run on a cycle of reincarnation, so when people die, the essence of their soul leaves their body, goes into the beyond, which is where the gods are, remains there for a while, and then comes back. The beyond is kind of like an analogy for the underworld in a sense, and so that's where souls come back from, and they enter into a new body. And that's a cycle of reincarnation known as the wheel, or Bereth's wheel. The study of the soul, so studying essence, is a science known as animancy. You can consider it an art as well to a point, but it's more of an academic field, so I would consider it a science in the sense of it's an academic field in the sense of like you're performing experiments in a lab, forming hypotheses, and learning about essence and its properties and how to manipulate it. Animancy is a huge part of the narratives, being able to understand the soul, look into past lives, ask questions of previous lives of people that have souls, etc., etc. As well, there is a class that is connected to souls, it's called ciphers, but all magic in the world has to do with essence. Whether you are channeling the power of your own soul or you are using another person's soul as a focus to channel energy. If you're a druid, then you would use the souls in nature. If you're a chanter, you would use the essence that is just in the ambient environment around you. If you're interested in any of this stuff, I do have episodes on those specific topics like the soul, the wheel, different classes, and how magic works. You can look all that kind of stuff up there. But I would center your pitch around that, the technological age, the cycle of reincarnation, the fact that souls and the gods are a real factual thing, and that the stories around those, particularly animancy, which is the study of essence, the stuff souls are made of, that's a key part of the entire story. And a lot of that's going to come down to a lot of the stories are going to come down to that you guys make at the table. If the players all seem interested, I would then move into the geography of the world. More importantly, I would look into the political superpowers. And you can split that into three main categories, in my opinion. You have the old empires, you have what I'm calling the New World powers, and the distant lands. So the old empires are Aedir, Valia, and Rauatai. I'm not going to talk about them. I'm either assuming that you, the DM, have a running understanding of this world, or you can listen to the episodes about them. But those three old empires have been around for hundreds of years. They're kind of like, in an analogy in my head, they're almost like the European powers in the world right around the time when they started discovering North America. So Rauatai, Valia, and Aedir. And then At some point in the history, those three powers, they are exploring the world of Eora, and the continent known as the Eastern Reach is discovered. You can almost think of this like when North America was discovered. Different empires started colonizing the Eastern Reach. As well, it turns out that there were already people living on the Eastern Reach. So the Deerwood and Rayed Saris, for example, those are colonies of Aedir. The Glanfathan tribes are the native tribes that were already living on the Eastern Reach. There's a few other places as well that you could, if you want to mention them, you could, such as the White March or the Valian Republics, things like that. But I think the most important thing is Deerwood, Valian Republics, and Glanfath. Valian Republics is started out as a colony by the old Valia Empire. So these are like the new rising powers, and you can think of this as like America and Canada and Mexico and all that. You can think of those new powers. They're rising in strength in the world, and they are getting their own bearings while these older civilizations are starting to collapse. And then we have what I'm calling the distant lands, which I get from the fandom website. And these include the Deadfire Archipelago, which is a setting for the second game, and it's a chain of islands that span a wide part of the ocean in the world. The Living Lands, which is where Avowed is going to be taking place, which is a wild frontier that is vastly unexplored. And we have the White That Wends, which is kind of this world's version of the South Pole, Antarctica. So those are the different geographies. Those are the main areas. Those are the main nations or powers that have a role to play in the stories in the world. And so having your players be familiar with at least 2 or 3 of those categories, depending on what you want to play, I think would be important. If, again, they continue to seem interested and you move into character creation, you can then look at the cultures of each one of those places. My recommendation, as I will always give in this entire episode, is don't force yourself to homebrew or have prepared a lot of content for your tabletop game until it becomes relevant to the game itself. So, for example, don't recreate and homebrew an entire monk class that's consistent with Pillars of Eternity lore, and then it turns out none of your players want to play that. You know what I'm saying? Like, maybe have a vague idea in your head on how you'd like to proceed forward with something like that, but don't homebrew an entire thing. Unless you really, really want to and you have the time and energy, then all power to you. But the same with all this pitch that you're doing, and same with all these cultures and backgrounds and helping with character creation. Worry about that when it comes time to deal with it. Those, I think, are the most important aspects of the World of Eora when you're pitching it to people. Once they have that down and they're interested in it, you can get into talking things about like the calendar. You can get into things like the specifics of the culture of this location or what a person from that nation might be like. And then you can start talking about the gods if any of them are interested in them, right? So then you can move into that area. And again, if you want any help with stuff like that, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. As well, go on to Reddit and other communities for Pillars of Eternity, or even just DM homebrewing communities. People will help you out with this stuff. Now, I want to move on to discussing races, subraces, and monsters, and how you can shoehorn the Dungeons & Dragons rule set and content into the setting of Eora.
Hello? Hello?
Now, as I hopefully mentioned in the introduction to this episode, because I'm recording them separately today just for scheduling reasons. But so minimalist brute force conversion, it's going to be very simple, and it's going to take currently existing Dungeons & Dragons rules and content, and we're going to put them into the World of Eora. Before I can really dive in to things that you can take from D&D to put in Eora, I want to say this. The most important thing, in my opinion anyways, about the World of Eora and the stories that you will tell in there is not so much the races and the classes and things like that. It is where you're from and your connection to essence. Those, to me, are the core parts of this world that really generate the stories, right? Like if you talk to someone from Glanfath, then that says a lot more than if you're talking to somebody who's a wood elf, right? So the reason I think that is important is because I'm going to get into a discussion on races. So if you are looking to play in the setting of the World of Eora for D&D 5th edition, and you're wanting to use races that exist in Dungeons & Dragons lore, what races can you use? I want to point out right off the bat that it actually doesn't really matter that much. Okay, and I know some people might be like raising an eyebrow at me right now, but like stop and think about this. If the Aedir Empire, which I've talked about in other episodes, was compromised of, I don't know, say tieflings and Goliaths, largely speaking, other than obviously some granular parts of the lore, largely speaking, the stories could remain the same. You know what I'm saying? Like, what unique or specific fantasy races are ascribed to what nations aren't so much important as the nation's identity and culture itself. You get what I'm saying? You don't actually have to fret too much over finding races in Dungeons & Dragons that are really, really close to the races in Eora. You could honestly pick 6 just right out of the rulebook or whatever source book. You pick random 6. You could do Triton, Goliath, Tiefling, Half-Elf, Tabaxi. You could pick any 6 you want, and you could make it work, okay? But for the sake of simplicity, and I would say easiness, which I guess that's simplicity, to make it easy on you to not have to change a lot of things, let's just stick with things that are approximate. So the really obvious ones would be humans, dwarves, and elves. They exist in Eora. They also exist in Dungeons & Dragons. So those 3 can be just transposed from the Dungeons & Dragons system into Eora with a little bit of tweaking, but we'll talk about this in a second. And then when it comes to Amauans, Orlans, and the Godlike, we just need to pick current races that exist within Dungeons & Dragons content and rules that fit the bill well. Again, you could technically pick anything you want and make the narratives work. There might be a little bit of dissonance. You might have to suspend your disbelief a little bit when playing the game, but for the sake of a good, fun game with people at the table, I think it's worth making it work. But again, for simplicity's sake, let's try to pick something approximate. I think in the case of Orlans, which are small, diminutive, hairy humanoids, I think halflings make the most sense. You can make an argument for other ones, but I think with just looking at the core races, I think halflings are the easiest ones to put in there. Now, you would just ascribe, we'll talk about subraces in a second, but you would split halflings down the middle for who is either wild Orlans or hearth Orlans, if you're familiar with the lore. But we'll talk about that in a second. But I think halflings is a good transposition for that one. If you want to add a little bit of flavor, say that they have big ears. You can do that. As for Amauans and Godlike from Eora, that's a little bit more tricky, but there are ways of approaching it. For Amauans, I had someone suggest to me once that you could use Tritons or Goliaths, and both of those would work just fine. Honestly, it doesn't matter. You could pick Minotaurs. It doesn't matter. Just pick something. But you could pick Tritons because they're a little bit more aquatic-based. I don't think that's exactly that approximate because they're a little bit too aquatic in my mind. And Goliaths are big and tall and wide and strong, just like an Amauan is, but they don't have any of that aquatic features. As well, the Goliath is kind of meant more, I'd say, deep inland. So I don't know if that would work. Actually, honestly, it really would work. I don't know what I'm saying. Goliaths would work just fine if you wanted to. But I'm going to stick with the core races of D&D because I'm not going to assume that anyone listening to this has extra source books for Dungeons & Dragons. For my money, personally speaking, and I know a lot of people will disagree with this, I choose Dragonborn. If I'm ever going to play this game for people, I might have players that are very new to Dungeons & Dragons, so I don't want to offload all this homebrew content to them. I just want to use core D&D. I would use Dragonborns, and the reason I use Dragonborns is because there's a nice split down the middle with Dragonborns of chromatic and metallic dragons, and I can correlate those to the subraces of Amaua that exist in the world of Eora, the island Amauans and the coastal Amauans. As well, I don't really like using firearms in my games. I'm okay with my players doing it if they are okay with managing the rules, but it gets a little complicated when my players have guns in a world where everyone should be able to have them. If it's just the player and he's figured it out, that's one thing, but when the world itself has them and I don't like having guns. And the reason that's important is because Rauatai, their naval army, is a really important part of their culture, and they should have something like that, right? If I don't want to run guns in my game, and that's just because I'm lazy, that's not because I think they're bad. I'm just a lazy DM. I can admit that. But the Dragonborn have the fire breath, so I'm kind of like roughly swapping out for that. That's an example of using Dragonborns in lieu of Amaua. But honestly, I think a really good option would just be to use the stat block for half-orcs. You'll have to rename them into Amaua or something because half-orcs and half-elves and half this and half that doesn't exist. There's no interbreeding in Pillars of Eternity or Eora. I would choose the stat blocks for half-orcs. I might look up on the internet a picture of a Amauan and say, this is actually what you're going to play, but we're going to use the half-orc stat block. You might have to change a thing here or there depending on how consistent you want it to be, but that's up to you. Those are 2, in my opinion, good suggestions. When it comes to the godlike, I argue that you should use the tiefling as the basis for the godlike. They have the horns on the head, so that kind of matches. And then you just flavor the tiefling with the god that is associated with it. So you could use the regular tiefling stat block, but if it's, with Remergond instead of someone like Magrin, who is more associated with fire, Remergond's more associated to cold, you would just have the tiefling be a little bit more chill. They would be blue instead of red. They would have ice instead of fire, and the resistances would match up. You would flavor a little bit, right? So you're going to have to do a little bit of homebrew work, but just trading out a feature here and there. And that's very easy to do on paper, and I believe you can even do it on D&D Beyond without much trouble. So those are some examples of things that you could do for transposing D&D content into the world of Eora. The humans, orcs, and dwarves transfer very easily. Orlans, I think, make well for halflings. The Amauans, I would argue, is either half-orcs or dragonborn. For godlikes, I would recommend you do tieflings. Now, I know and I recognize that a lot of you aren't liking this conversion so far because it's either too lazy or too inconsistent or blah, 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 blah. For those of you who have the energy and the passion to do some more homebrewing, I encourage you to do that as much as you can. But I have talked to a number of people that want to play Pillars of Eternity. They want to play in the World of Eora in D&D, but they just, the idea of homebrewing seems too big. So I'm trying to make this as accessible as humanly possible for everybody out there. That way you can start playing in the World of Eora, in a world that you love, without much in your way. I don't want the things like these races have to look and feel this exact way to stop you from playing in this world, because it's a great world. And I think as you guys play, you'll become more confident in your skills, and you'll start to change the races here and there until they become a little bit more like the races we know and love. Does that make sense? Again, I know there's going to be some contention, but there's going to be a few people out there for sure to which this information is useful. So that's why I'm putting it out there. Now, this is where things get really important, in my opinion, is, again, the important thing isn't so much what you are in the World of Eora, but where you come from. If I'm talking to an elf, that's cool and all, but it's actually more important if I'm talking to a White That Wins Pale elf, or a wood elf from Erglonfath, or a wood elf from the Aedir Empire directly. And this is where I think subraces in D&D come into play. Again, I am assuming some familiarity with the Dungeons & Dragons process, and I'm assuming a little bit more familiarity with the World of Eora, So assuming that you're at least basically familiar with how those two systems work, this is what I think you can do. You can use the subraces from races that you're choosing in the Dungeons & Dragons character creation, and let the subrace be kind of a placeholder for the nation you're from. So, for example, if you're choosing an elf to play in the World of Eora, you're going to select elf as your race from the Dungeons & Dragons rule set. How you determine what nation you're from, for me anyways, when I play at the table with brand new characters to this world who I'm just trying to introduce very, very gently into all this lore, I tell them what subrace you choose will tell me what nation you're from. So if they choose a wood elf, I tell them that they are from Erglonfath. If they choose a high elf, I tell them that they are from Aedir. There's a little bit of inconsistency there, but I just make it work because I think it's more important that these new players get into it. And if they choose a drow, I say that they are from the White That Wins. If they do choose a drow, I do finagle around with the race a little bit. I remove the penalty when they're out in the sun, for example, and I add cold resistance to their character because that makes sense for the lore. So that's just one example of something you can do. Humans are very easy. You basically just describe what your character looks like, and they can pick which nation they're from. That you really don't need a lot more than that. If you want to add more, all power to you. But if you just I don't have a lot of time, I don't have energy, it seems too overwhelming, you can just pick human, and then you can describe the nation they're from, assuming you've made your players familiar. Dwarves, again, super easy. Mountain dwarf to mountain dwarf. And then in Pillars of Eternity, there is the boreal dwarf, and you can just make that the hill dwarf from the Dungeons & Dragons character creation. Again, simple as possible. Just try to keep things the same. That, if it's a dwarf, then just make it a dwarf from one rule set to the other. Does that make sense? And then when it comes to Amauans, it depends on what you name them as. Like if you did them as half-orcs, then you just have to decide where they're from. It doesn't really matter. You can say they all look the same or very similar, that maybe there's some differences. If it's dragonborn, for instance, then you can say chromatic dragons are island Amawa and metallic dragons are coastal Amawa, for example, right? You can just make it 1-to-1. With tieflings, again, I would just say use the tiefling stat block, and then when your player has discussed which god they want to be blessed by, then just change some of the flavor of the tiefling, maybe swap in or out a couple features here and there, which again, super easy to do. If it's on paper, you just write it in words. If it's on D&D Beyond, I think there's a way to do it that's very easy. You just add a trait here, or you remove this, or you rename something there. And then with the Orlins, what again I'm using is halflings. Halflings are split into 2 subraces, and Orlins in the World of Eora are split into 2 subraces, so you just pick one that matches the other. And boom, there you go. You have your races, you have where they're from. It isn't comprehensive, like it's not addressing characters that can be from every tiny little place in the world. Like I haven't made any examples for Orlins that come from Ishadamil, because there are Orlins that can come from Ishadamil, right? So there are some limitations, but again, this is an entry-level kind of thing. It's minimalist, it's brute force. It's not a comprehensive conversion. So that's how I would run that. And then the last thing that you really need, that I really want to talk about today, I'm going to talk about other things in the next episode, but today, the last thing I want to talk about is monsters. And monsters couldn't be easier. All you really need to do as a dungeon master is reskin a monster. That's it. So if you have a monster in Pillars of Eternity that you want to run in the game, but you're using Dungeons & Dragons and you're wondering, how do I do this? Find a monster whose stat block in the Dungeons & Dragons rule set is what you want. And then just pretend that the name of that monster is the one you're looking for. Seriously, it doesn't have to even be the same kind of monster. It doesn't have to have the same name. It doesn't have to have anything like that. If it has the stats that you want that make sense for the monster you're putting them up against, just use that stat, rename it for the monster you want. Just reskin the monster. If you want to do a little bit more homebrewing, again, all power to you. I think that's the least amount of work that you need to put into it, but still yields a positive and wonderful experience for you and the players. So just reskinning monsters. Now, I think that's everything I wanted to discuss in today's main episode. And now we're going to ask the question I usually ask, even though I don't really know how I'm going to answer this while I'm asking it, is, what does this have to do with Avowed?
Is an oath worth the weight of a crown?
So now, what does this have to do with Avowed? Well, not really anything, because we're just talking about how to take Dungeons & Dragons rules and fit it into the world of Eora. And I hope you liked today's episode. I understand that maybe this wasn't for everybody, and that there might be a couple contentions on, like, I don't think this fits here, and I don't know if you should necessarily be doing that kind of thing, taking that kind of a creative license. Again, I'm not trying to say anyone listening, this is what you ought to do. I'm just trying to give some people a starting point, because to some people, they want to play in Eora, but it seems like too big a project to homebrew, and even just transposing the rules seems like too big a project. So something like this is meant to give you almost the encouragement, like, oh, this is within reach. Like, I can definitely do this. Anyways, to get back to the main question, which is how does this affect Avowed? Again, it really doesn't, but here's what you can do, because Avowed is set in the universe of Eora, and we know where it's taking place. We know roughly when it's taking place. We have an example for an NPC that's going to be in the game, which is actually a companion named Kai. We actually have a lot of information also even about the main character of the game, an envoy from the nation of Adir, who is either a human or an elf, and they are looking into a soul corruption. So if you actually look at all the bits and pieces of things we already know about Avowed, anyone listening to this show, if you feel like you can run a tabletop game in the world of Eora, you could actually try to simulate what you guys think Avowed might be like. No, seriously, you could do that. So, like, set it in the world of the Living Lands. You, the Dungeon Master, you'll have to do a little bit of research on the Living Lands to get a feel for what it's like, but there's not a lot of lore on the Living Lands right now, so it's not a ton of research. Also, I've done an episode on the Living Lands way back in my early days of this podcast, if you want to check that out and just get a feel for it. And then as for races, if you restrict it to, well, you're from Adir, so you're a human or an elf, I mean, I guess you could open it up to whatever race you want. You could decide that you want anybody from this envoy to be a Maowan or what have you. But open it up that it's not just one person coming from Adir, it's all your player characters. They are an envoy team. So you have a team of people coming from the Adir Empire. So you'll want to know about the Adir Empire. Again, I have episodes on Adir if you want to know more. But those of you who are familiar with Pillars of Eternity, you have a basic understanding what that's like. And then the hook of the campaign or the set of adventures that you're going to have is that you are being sent by your empire, that is Adir, as an envoy to the Living Lands to investigate this soul corruption. Now, we don't know what the soul corruption is, so you as the DM, you're going to have to decide what that is. You're going to have to look into that kind of lore of souls and soul maladies, which, again, I have episodes on, but if you play the games you're familiar with, and kind of come up with your own idea of, like, what might be going on. What's going on in the Living Lands? How does this work? I've done a speculation episode where I take my own ideas and inspiration and other people's inspirations as well, if that helps. And then lastly, I would say get a feel for the character of Kai, who we see in the gameplay trailer and there is a cosplay guide for, and kind of use that as the first go-to person. with those little pieces in place, you could get a game started and then work your way out from there. And I think it would be really fun for those of you out there who are into tabletop games to play this game and then compare what you do at the table to how the game of Avowed actually ends up being. You know, like how close did the DM get to the storyline being the same? And if anything was the same, what decisions did the party make that were in the game or something like that? You know, like that could be a fun way to kind of compare and contrast. I think that would be a great thing to do. That'd be super fun. If anyone ever does something like that, feel free to record it. I would happily listen to a D&D game of that. That would be really cool. So that's the only thing I can think of for how it might relate to Avowed. That's everything we're going to talk about today in that regard. So we'll close out the episode now. What have I been playing? I've been playing Starfield. So I made a huge mistake. I made a massive mistake. You know, I've been playing Baldur's Gate 3, and I said to myself, "Hey, I'll just try Starfield. I'll just load it up and just give it a quick little introduction. I won't play it. I just want to see what this game is like. I won't play it for very long." And I knew better. I knew that that's not how it works, right? So I've started playing Starfield, just wanting to check it out. And before I knew it, I had sunk a few hours in, and I'm like, now this is the game that I want to play. But I'm like, I haven't finished Baldur's Gate. So I want to return to Baldur's Gate. But unfortunately, I already know how the quest line I'm kind of working toward ends, because at this point, everyone and their dog has played through Baldur's Gate and they're talking about it. So I kind of know what the different options are to my characters at this point. And I'm so close to the end, but I'm just like really wanting to play Starfield. And I've always been an advocate that if you have a game you want to play, just play it. Like, you only have so many minutes and hours in this world. Don't waste it playing games that you don't feel like playing. That being said, I'm also an advocate of like, make wise choices with your time and money. You know, I spent a lot of money on Baldur's Gate because I had to purchase it a second time so I could play it through the cloud. If you've heard my episode where I talk about that, I'm not going to give you the whole story, but I really should finish that game. So I'm bouncing between the two, so it's very slow going. But hey, it is what it is, and I'm having fun, and I'm looking forward to finishing Baldur's Gate, but I'm also looking forward to getting into space with Starfield. I know a lot of people have been kind of like not liking it or giving it mediocre results, but honestly, so far, I've been really enjoying it. I'm a little irritated in New Atlantis, which is the first major city you get to, because I am talking to every single NPC and doing every single side quest right now. And I'm realizing that, you know what, that's not the way to play this game. I think I need to be a little bit more focused on the main story and not so thoroughgoing and comprehensive in exploration. But anyways, that's what I've been playing. What have you guys been playing? And what did you think of today's episode? Did you like it? Did you not like it? Did you think it was stupid? Did you think it was an affront to everything Dungeons & Dragons and Eora? Because I certainly recognize the potential of what I said here with a lot of the try to shoehorn one set of content into the other. And we'll talk about classes on the next episode and what the differences are. I think most of the work is going to come with classes, by the way. So the next episode will feature a little bit more fine-tuning of the D&D rules. But anyways, if you liked today's episode, or you didn't, or you have comments, or you have advice, or anything you want to say to me or get on the show, send me an email, worldofeora@gmail.com. And while I'm talking about that, why not follow me on X/Twitter, which is @worldofeora. Thanks everyone for joining me on today's episode. I've been your host, Eric, aka Gingerino, and I'll see you guys next time.